goodness. What makes them distinct, right, is the particular nature of the goods, right, or creaturely natures. Just as concurrentism, all natural necessitation, is the push of divine power specified by the nature of the creaturely agent. On moral concurrentism, all moral necessity is the pull of divine goodness specified by the nature of the creatures involved. Above, we saw that on Aquinas' concurrentism about nature, about the laws of nature, the natural order involves both God as universal efficient cause and creatures as particularizers and determinants. What necessitates an effect of the natural order is this cooperation between God as general efficient cause and the particularities of the creaturely nature. Aquinas also writes that all creatures have God as their end, but that the manner in which they enjoy that good is diversified by their diverse natures. What necessitates action in the moral order is this cooperation between God as general final cause and the particularities of creaturely nature. So natural law theory is correct to claim that the goods that fulfill human persons specify the moral requirements that bind us. That your good includes life explains why I must not kill or assault you. That it includes knowledge explains why I must not lie to you, and so forth. But that your good normatively necessitates a certain response from me does not mean that this normative transaction is entirely between us. For your good simply is a participation in the divine goodness. And those particular sorts of participation in the divine goodness that require from me responses of promotion and respect are fixed by the kind of being that you are. And theological voluntarism is correct. For no normative necessitation occurs without divine involvement. But that divine involvement need not be an act of divine will, but rather the participation in the divine goodness in which all human goodness consists. I've played up the analogies between concurrentism as regards the natural order and concurrentism as regards the moral order. But let me close with an important disanalogy, one that I think bolsters the case for moral concurrentism rather than undermines it. Concurrence in the natural order is a matter of the cooperation of the divine will in creaturely causation. And exercises of divine will are free, and with respect to the natural order, contingent. Thus, we have to be very careful in characterizing the laws of nature, for they express necessitation relationships, like fire burns cotton, only given God's concurrence. And God may freely withhold God's concurrence. The natural effects do not occur. By contrast, moral concurrentism is not about efficient causation, but final causation. And this is not a matter about which God is free. God is goodness. God has no choice about whether God is the ultimate end of all things. If, for example, being human morally necessitates respect, then on the moral concurrentist view, the goodness of God and the humanity of a substance cooperate, necessitating respect for humans. But the goodness of God is as necessary as can be. And if humanity is a particularization of God's perfectly complete general goodness, then humanity morally necessitates respect, and does so necessarily, whether the world is as ordinary or as extraordinary as can be. Thank you very much.
If you have time for questions, I'll call on people. I'll let Mark answer the question. Do you want to stay here or do you want to run around?
I might now start here, and then I may draw on from the part of the room.
All the way draw.
And you can follow me. Okay, very good.
So I wanted to kind of defend the natural law view a little bit more. First, in your example of the benevolent legislators who make this law about your children, that doesn't seem like a fair analogy to natural law because it isn't something about the nature of your children that necessitates them receiving these benefits. But it's just a sort of arbitrary enactment. But more basically, you do not fix the natures of your children in the way that God fixes the natures of his creatures. Yeah. So when God creates something, he doesn't just create something of a predetermined character. He also chooses the nature that it has. And so in doing so, then he has a direct explanatory role in why it has the goodness that it has.
Okay. So look, I mean, there are two things I want to say. I mean, the example with respect to the children, this is my first defensive move, and then I'm going to sort of flap my arms for a little bit and wave my hands at an answer, right? So with respect to the example with about the children, right, that's not supposed to be, we might think of as a law theory generally, but a response to Finnis's specific account of how God enters the story, right? So in my only point there with it, it looks like everything that Finnis appeals to, right, in explaining God's role in fixing the natural law, none of it is concerned with what we might call the validity, right, or the normative power, right, that the moral law is supposed to have, right? All of it is concerned with what we might call application conditions, right? The conditions under which someone might be able to understand what the natural law is, or to be able to do anything about it, or to be the kind of thing, or even to exist as the kind of thing to whom it applies, and so forth. Right? So it's only a very limited thing, and I think you're right. If I tried to use it as anything more than that, it would be bad, right? And I don't want to be bad. So that's just right. Okay. So you want to say that I mean, I take it that what you're providing here is not an objection to my specific, to my answer to Finnis, but just saying there's a fourth natural law option, right? So I said, well, you know, there's this answer in terms of it's got to be divine natural law, it's law, not norms, or it's just necessary, just a basic necessary truth. Or there's this sort of Finnis story about application. But you're going to say, well, why isn't there a fourth story that the natural law theorists can give, right? And the story is one in which God's actually responsible, right, for the natures themselves, right? So, this is heavy, man. I mean, really. I'm with you, right? So you say, all right, that God is somehow responsible for the character of the property, for the existence and character of the properties that enter into moral law. Properties like being human and so forth, right? I mean, so we had a speaker here last week that was defending a view kind of like this. And I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but so you're right. I need to say more about this. But let me make two sort of little points, right? So one little point that I wouldn't take to be satisfactory as a way of explaining how God's responsible for these properties is a view that you might call just Aristotelianism about properties, right? Just, what role does God have for these properties being in existence? Well, there are really no such thing as unexemplified properties, right? So by God's creating humans, God sees to it that there's a property being human, right? That can enter into the law. In my view, this strikes me as so highly mediated, right? In terms of the role God has with respect to the natural law, that's not good enough for my purposes. I mean, you could press me then on, well, why are you so down on mediated explanation? I need to say more about that as well. But here's this other view where you say, well, no, actually what I'm looking for, right, is a more activist view in which God is somehow the active cause of properties themselves, even apart from the instances. And I don't know how illuminating this is going to be, but look, I mean, whenever I hear stories like this, right, about God's role, I mean, this is not to deny the view about God being the cause of property, because I think, actually, the considerations I raise, I think, commit me to thinking that God has a role sort of like this. It seems to me that there are two things that need to be explained. So one, you can say, well, look, so God has a role in bringing into existence these properties. Great. All right, God thinks them up or something like that. But any of these views have to have, I think, a sort of a further story, right? And let me sort of give the general further story you need and then the specific further. You need a general story about why properties have what I call the modal relations they have with respect to each other, right? Why is it that the property that God thinks of being cat, right, is necessarily related in some way to being mammal or something like that, right? Now, on my view, right, a moral law is something like a relation of moral necessitation between properties. Being human and being respected, right? Being human morally necessitates a certain sort of respect. And what I need to know is about, okay, so fine. So God thinks up the properties being human and being respected and so forth. Right? So now what's the story you want to give me about why they bear this specific necessitation relationship, right? What's that all about, okay? And as far as I can tell, until I have a sort of a good story about that makes me, oh, I see now, right? I want to say, well, here's a story that I give, right? The reason why this property morally necessitates is because it's, in a relevant sense, a divine likeness, right? That's why. So in a way, I'm happy with sort of this thing. Yeah, God's got to explain the properties in some way, but I want a further explanation of why it morally necessitates. And I think this is the second part, the specific. I think it's particularly pressing with moral properties, right? So look, I mean, does everyone want to say this? I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I might take this back in a minute. But I mean, it's not obvious to me, right, that it's just say it, Murphy. Okay, not all properties have moral import, right? And so, did I yell? Not all properties have moral import, right? And I want to know, well, why is it some of these properties, right, that God thinks up, right, have the specific kind of moral importance that they have, right? I would say, well, maybe some of them involve, essentially, right, involve this kind of likeness to the divine, this kind of divine likeness, right, that makes it the case that they morally necessitate, right, in various ways. So that's my, I think you're right. You'll notice that this is a good reason why I didn't talk about this stuff in this talk. I mean, this requires a lot, sort of saying a lot more about why this type of solution, I think, is either unsatisfying or incomplete in a way that might need my kind of answer, right, in order to fill it out. That's a great question, though. Thank you very much.
Paul?
Oh.
I'm going to ask you what your critique of the natural law you can. And let me just refer to pages 7 to 8.
I don't have the same version you have.
Oh, you don't?
Yeah, I don't. But just read out a little bit, and we'll.
Okay. It's a crucial paragraph. The natural.
Okay. My wife is offering her paper. All right. So here we go.
You remember it.
I don't know.
The natural law, as you sum up your criticism, or one of your criticisms, the natural law theorist thus explains the moral law and its features ultimately by appealing to facts about human nature, effective and non-effective realization.
Yeah.
Here's the rub: at no point in my account of the natural law view on moral norms that is God. The explanation of moral norms proceeds from the nature of the good and the features of human action to the intrinsic validity of certain moral norms, and we should be asking whether this is acceptable as a result.
It sounds great when you read it. That's really smart. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
It's really smart. I just have a question about if I understood the view correctly, you're not so far from that. You just think that an explanation of the nature of the good has to ultimately be theistic.
Yes.
And that.
Yes.
So I'd just be interested in knowing exactly where the difference between this line, or why doesn't Finis think that the explanation of the good has to be theistic? Or maybe is the idea something like this, that you think goodness couldn't necessitate unless goodness were a participation in the divine nature, and he thinks goodness could necessitate even if it weren't? I mean, is that where the difference lies? Or?
So look, I mean, my reasons for pushing this sort of this theistic explanation, right, are not first and foremost on account of that I have this view that, oh yes, there couldn't be a non-theistic explanation. There couldn't be. This is kind of hard. There couldn't be a non-theistic explanation about how these goods could necessitate. That's not the reason, because that's random grounded stuff. I think that in a way, if you sort of push me on the question of, well, how is it they necessitate on the theistic view, right? I think it's also kind of mysterious, frankly. The moral necessitation is itself kind of strange on both views. But I think that sort of on the theist view, right, we ought to say that because of the kind of property goodness is, right, it's got to be theistically explained. That the mystery of moral necessitation, right, should be theistically explained, right? Even if we don't have the details in a way that sort of makes it entirely unmysterious. That's the first thing. Now, back to this thing about what you said about how is your view different from the standard natural law theory? So look, I mean, when I'm criticizing the standard natural law theorists, that's me I'm talking about. I mean, I defended that view with great vigor and confidence. Okay, and then I thought, well, I've got sort of a worry between sort of the fact that I'm a theist and the fact that I've described this whole view that seems to have nothing theistic about it. Here's a way of so I don't want to deny any of the stuff about the good being fixed by our natures or anything like that, right? But what I want to say is, in ultimately giving an account of what our good is, again, it has to the specific character of our good has to be understood partly explained theistically, partly with respect to our created natures. Okay. Now why is that? Okay. So how do you do this, right? So look, I mean, when I defended this sort of standard natural law view, right? What I wanted to say was something like the following: for something to be part of the human good, right? As it's sort of an Aristotelian story, is for it to be our characteristic activity, given the kind of thing that we are. I think that if we talk about that in terms of functions, right? I'm trying to got the best quick way of doing this. If you talk about a thing's function, you inevitably have to refer to some kind of value notion in talking about function, whether it's in terms of some good realized through carrying out that function, or some intended good that the designer had in mind, or something like that, right? So what I want to say, right? What I want to say is that for something to be a human good is something like the following: that for X to be a human good is for X to be a divine likeness, that it's the humankind to exemplify or to realize, or something like that, right? So, and all the kind stuff about the humankind is stuff that I would take over from the standard natural law theorists. What I take from this sort of theistic stuff is I want to say it's the divine likeness that fixes, right? That sort of gives what we might call sort of the normative character to, right? These sorts of functions. Boy, you look puzzled. Okay, go.
I'm just trying to get a picture on whether there's some argument for that, other than that God has to have something to do.
God has to have something to do.
It's not an argument about the necessitation, the way that it's necessitated.
No. I mean, so do I have an argument that says, oh, look, there's no way that this sort of view could work, right? Unless you had God sort of coming, writing rescue and showing activity. No, I don't have any argument like that at all. I mean, like I said, it seems to me that one could be. So if someone were a non-theistic natural law theorist, right? I think there might be some sort of puzzling features of their view, right? But nothing that strikes me as absolutely devastating, right? Now I do think that there's, and this won't be a great argument. This will be sort of, again, this kind of hand wave, right? But you can say, look, isn't it kind of interesting that the goods of these various kinds of things show a certain pattern to them, right? That they involve life and procreation and society and so forth. Things that look like they're the kinds of properties that interestingly bear some resemblance to a kind of creating being, if there were any such being, right? I think that's you might be able to raise questions about why the various goods that things have in nature, right? Why they exhibit a certain pattern that might be better explained theistically, but it's just not the sort of thing that I really want to write on. I mean, I think like I said, what I'm interested in thinking about is whether or not we should, as theists, right, think there's a strong reason to make sure that God enters the explanation in specific ways, rather than sort of making fun of non-theistic explanations as being just inadequate. Thank you. Was Jim?